Hello and welcome to episode 7 of TE Present Teacher. In this episode, we are going to talk about developing writing skills. Why is it necessary to develop writing skills? What is the importance of having writing skills in an era where technology is making us type more and more? And to talk about it, we have Ritu, who's a renowned expert in foundational learning. Hi, Ritu.
Hi.
Yeah, she's also the founder of Things Education, just FYI. So, Ritu, last time we spoke about reading and reading comprehension and also reading with fluency. And we thought that, hey, something that goes very hand in hand with reading is also writing. So we thought that, hey, let's talk about writing and writing, especially in an age where, more and more people are thinking about the future. What is 20 years down the line going to be for a student who's just starting off school right now? Will they really need to write? There'll be tablets and cell phones everywhere. Do they need to write? So I just wanted to talk about that today. So that's why we have also titled this episode, Why Are We Still Writing? Um, because we want to get into the extremely scientific and research-backed reasons of why writing is important, especially during the formative years of a student's development. Um, so without getting into too much of the intro, let's start with the first question, which I have for you. Let's start with just, figuring out what writing is. When we say writing, what is writing?
So, there are many aspects of writing. There are conversations we can have on handwriting. There are conversations we can have on different forms of, creative writing, descriptive writing, informative writing. But for the purposes of this conversation, we'll take the most basic definition of writing, which is that writing is putting symbols on any surface to communicate ideas or to communicate your thoughts to people who are not either in the same place as you or will be looking at those at a different time from you.
Right. I think that's a great place to start. And I mean, having such a general definition of writing helps. So let's just get a little bit deeper into this writing, the skill of writing or the knowledge of writing that students have to develop. And it's very interesting that from an evolutionary point of view, from an evolutionary psychology point of view, would you say that writing is a secondary skill? And if you can just elaborate a little bit on what primary and secondary skills are also, so that we know what we're discussing about.
Let's just use very simple terms here. Every child that is born um, learns how to eat and learns how to drink, and over time learns how to walk. And these are skills that you need to survive. Without these, you're not going to be able to survive very well. And our brain is wired to learn these skills automatically. Even if no one teaches you how to walk, you will eventually learn how to walk. Even if you are not taught a language explicitly, over time, if you're exposed to it enough, you will learn how to speak that language and understand it. So these are primary skills because these are needed for survival. And so our brains, fantastic that they are, uh, make these so important that every child, every living thing that is born needs to learn them automatically. And then there are what is called secondary skills, which are good but are not important for survival. And these are skills that we have invented. Reading is a skill that we invented. Reading is not something that is natural, it's an invention. And similarly, writing is a skill that we invented. It's not something that is natural, it was something that was created out of a need. And so everyone who has to learn how to read and write has to do it from scratch. There's nothing already in our brain, there's no wiring present in our brain to help us to do it. As we learn it, that wiring gets built, that wiring gets developed, and that's why it's so difficult, and that's why without real research back support, a lot of kids struggle with these skills.
Right, that makes sense. I mean, whatever was needed for my survival would have been evolutionary conserved, through different times during the evolution of the human being. Um, and clearly, we didn't need to read or write to be able to survive. But we did need to see, we need to observe, we need to communicate by speaking that, hey, there's a dangerous tiger there, don't go, you'll get killed, whatever. So yeah, that I think that makes a lot of sense. So when students start looking at uh, when they start reading, when they start looking at these symbols on a piece of paper, and then they're asked to make those symbols on a piece of paper, that is basically writing, they would, it won't even be intuitive for them that, okay, you know what, this is what is expected of me. Just like we adults now kind of know that, okay, you know, if it's something like, if it's a circle in a word, it's generally going to be O. If it's a circle in numbers, it's going to be zero. It's kind of intuitive for us.
So none of this is intuitive because, again, it's a completely new.
It's an invention, it's something completely new that kids are learning. And because everyone is made to learn it, we often assume that it should come naturally to kids, but it's like expecting a kid to know how to play the guitar just because uh, they've been exposed to it enough times. It's not going to happen because it's not something our brain is wired for. So similarly, I think there are a lot of examples which we take for granted that kids would know. But when you read studies, you realize how logical it is that a kid would not know it. For example, when parents or teachers read stories out to kids don't realize that words and pictures are separate things. They may imitate an adult and move their hand across a page, but they don't really know that those black things on the white page are words, and that is what the story is.
They just think that the whole page is telling them the story. Um, it's so it has to be explicitly taught that the picture is a picture which tells you only one moment in that story or on that page, whereas the words is what is telling you. The words are what are telling you what the actual story is.
I think that's one example that's coming to mind. Again, I think we take for granted that kids will know that we have to go from left to right while reading, top to bottom while reading. Similarly for writing, but they don't know that. It's something that they have to be taught that we always start from the left of a page in certain languages and go from left to right and then top to bottom.
Right. So what we're saying is, A, it's going to be difficult for students or anyone basically who's learning to write. B, there are conventions that we have come up with, which is basically come out of thin air almost. Um, so these conventions need to be practiced over and over again, like a skill, etc. Um, Now I'm going to superimpose all of these things to today's student who basically needs to not write, doesn't need to actually write ever. Now, what would your argument be to continue teaching handwriting in these preschool classes for these students?
To answer the bigger question, kids definitely should be writing by hand, regardless of what is going to happen in the future. And it's already happening because as adults, how many of us still carry around notebooks and pens? How many of us even own pens that are always on us? So writing by hand is not something that we're expected to do every day. But yet I strongly believe, and I think it's backed by a lot of studies, that writing by hand and learning to write by hand in the early years has a lot of benefits for learning. And so it shouldn't be done away with, for sure.
Okay, then obviously my next question is going to be, what are these benefits and how do these benefits manifest?
Okay, so I'll try to explain it in the shortest and simplest way possible. There's a reading crisis in, at least in India, that has been going on for very long. And the problem there is that kids are not learning to read fluently enough. And even if there is fluency, they're not learning to comprehend. And what does this have to do with writing is the question here. Um, Writing actually makes reading fluency a lot easier. And I'll explain that. The more we use our hands to write letters, the stronger the connections become in our brain between that movement and the part of the brain that that encodes these letters, that remembers the form of these letters. So being exposed to different letters of, say, the English language in this case, is good. It's very good, but it's one form of connection. You see it, you remember it. But what studies have shown is that in our long-term memory, the stronger the connections become, the more the connections that there are, the deeper that understanding, or the deeper the learning is. So looking at a letter is great. Writing a letter is great. Singing about a letter is great. And not just writing it, but using clay to form the forms of the letter, using paint, using pebbles, and making the letter. All of that is important for those connections in the brain to become stronger. And if we do away with writing, if we do away with learning how to write by hand, we do away with a lot of these activities that give exposure to kids to these letters over and over again. Then we're expecting them to just either read or just use a tablet and write on it. And that's one form of exposure over and above looking at it. And maybe another nuance over that is the feel of the letter when you're maybe doing it with clay, or you're forming the letter with clay, or you're forming it in sand, or you're using different materials like leaves and beads to form the letter. The feel of the letter is also another connection that's being formed in the brain and helping kids remember the form of the letter better, which in turn makes reading fluency a lot better. And the more fluent you are with reading, the better you will be at comprehension over time. And so writing forms one of the key skills. Writing by hand forms one of the key skills before kids become good readers.
Right. I think that I think I understood all of that. I mean, there were lots of small points that you made there. If I can summarize some of them, so one is that there's a motor connect. I mean, the region in your brain that controls the motor activities or the movements, that and the region in the brain that recognizes these symbols as letters. Once that connection is established, it helps in reinforcing what the letter is, and recognition of the letter becomes better, and so it will help in reading. And second, I think the thing that you said was when you're doing it with different kinds of material like clay, sand, etc., there is a sensory part of the brain, or the part of the brain that senses or feels this on your fingers or wherever, which also makes a connection with the letter recognizing area of your brain, and that also reinforces the recognition of letters. Yes, not only should handwriting be in the syllabus, but you're saying that all the other techniques of using different kinds of material, using tactile sensations to figure out what the how a letter looks should still remain in the syllabus.
Yes, yes. I think the only thing I'll add there is I think that a lot of schools don't actually do sensory activities as part of writing, and there needs to be an active inclusion of all these sensory activities as part of handwriting learning.
Right. Thanks. I think that's an important point. I think we do miss out on the sensory, the sense, the connection between the senses and the letter recognition parts. I think that's a good point. Yes. Now I'm going to dive down a little bit more into the nuance of this. When you say writing, there is one thing, and especially writing by hand, I remember, and this is not a nice memory for me, let me be honest. I remember filling in pages and pages and pages of, writing those letters with those dotted lines first and then no dotted lines. And I used to, there used to be homework for 20 pages per day or some insane number. I don't even know how many pages, but insane number. And I did not get the point of it. At some point of time, if I had to write an A, I would be making designs of that A and writing it, not writing it the right way. Clearly, I mistook what the assignment was, and you know my handwriting. So there's a direct link there. So when we're talking about handwriting, are we talking about freestyle writing? Are we talking about tracing on paper? What are we talking about here?
Hi, we have developed an amazing tool to help teachers plan their lessons, TEPS, or Things Education's pedagogical strategies. TEPS helps teachers by reducing the time that they spend on planning lessons. TEPS also helps you if you want to try a different pedagogical approach to teaching. So, if you want to know how to teach a topic in a project-based or inquiry-based or even constructivist learning approach, TEPS is for you. TEPS helps even seasoned teachers with fresh ideas on how to teach specific topics. So, scan the QR code on the screen or visit teps.school and join a community of empowered educators. Great teaching begins with TEPS.
I think we're talking about a mix of these things. I think what you remember is definitely not a good memory, and it's definitely not a good approach. We shouldn't be getting kids to write pages over pages of the same letter, because boredom is not good for learning, and fatigue is not good for learning. It's definitely useful to practice. So school shouldn't be doing away with those sheets, and kids should practice these things. But that's one of the many, many ways that we get kids to practice letter writing. Um, Tracing is good, writing in a particular form on lines is good. All of that is good, because the better your handwriting it is, the better you communicate, the more your confidence is. So those are definitely good things. But insisting on perfect writing, on just tracing, is not good. And again, there's a reason for that. We see so many different fonts around us every day. Boards on social media, there are so many different kinds of fonts, and most of us are able to read all of that pretty easily. And that's because we've been exposed to different shapes of the same letter over time, and our brain has sort of now learned that if it generally looks this way, this is what the letter is. If it generally looks like a circle, it's probably O. And that's true for kids also, because kids are also going to be exposed to many different fonts, and insisting that they write perfectly in either block, print, or cursive, or whatever form the school is following, is not useful for the real world. So one kid should be allowed the freedom to write letters untidily or in unconventional ways, and that's fine, because again, it's the brain is learning that as long as the letter sort of looks, the shape sort of looks this way, this is what the letter is, which is useful for the real world. And it takes away from the fatigue and the boredom, which is ultimately not good for learning anyway.
Right. So there is a need to trace, there is a need to write in different ways. And both these things kind of help in different things. Is that a good understanding of what you're saying? Okay, so a lot of the things that you mentioned, Ritu, it also reminds me of a slightly later time in my life when I was trying to learn a new language. Um, Much later on, I think it was when I was in my late teens, I started learning Kannada and actually writing and reading Kannada. And I remember trying to read Kannada and recognize letters, etc. And that is how I was taught. And I mean, this was taught by my grandfather, so there was no professional teaching, etc. But first, I had to recognize the letters, and then he said that, okay, you know what? Now you start writing. But it became so much easier to recognize letters once I had started writing them. So I think a lot of these things that you're telling me kind of resonate in that sense. And from a scientific and my biology mind kind of tells me that, okay, you know what? Yes, we know that if you spend more time with something, you are going, I mean, that is going to get reinforced in your brain. And writing actually helps you spend more time with things, right? I mean, forget about biology, etc. In our own experiences, when we have thoughts, if we don't write it down, they're a mess. As soon as we write it down, they become so much clearer for us. Just spending that amount of time, I think, helps in this case. So we have spoken a little bit about the cognitive psychology and the actual biology of what writing does to you. One thing that we haven't spoken about, and we're probably not going to speak about it today, but we will do it in another episode, is actually the physical development that happens in a child when they are learning to write. Um, the what we talked about, the movements, the motor skills. That is something that we haven't spoken about, and we will talk about it some other time. Having said that, having made that clarification, I think I would want to move into actually now talking about what we can do in the classroom. We understand the cognitive psychology behind it, we understand the biology behind this, why writing and specifically handwriting or writing by hand is important. If we can come to, okay, now that we know that these things are important, what is it the approach that we need to take to develop these skills in this, changing world where technology is going to take over at some point of time for the students also while they're writing?
So the first point in this approach, I think that every educator should know is that writing doesn't develop out of thin air. Children go through stages, and a lot of observations, a lot of studies have boiled this now down to a few stages of writing development. Um, and maybe we can show the visual on screen so that people can see what it actually looks like. But basically, when kids start, they'll usually hold crayons in their fist and they'll scribble in circular ways. And I know that teachers and parents do get frustrated with that. But that's the first stage of beginning to write. Then they move to scribbling that is from left to right, because they slowly start to learn that we always have to go from left to right when we are writing. Then they start creating letter-like forms, which then move on to letters. And so writing goes through these various stages. And just because a child is writing letter-like forms and not actual letters, that doesn't mean that they're off track. It means that they're completely on track, and we need to know how to push them forward. That, like I said, the first point in that approach needs to be to just be aware of these different stages of writing, and knowing that there are things that we can do to push kids along further so that they start writing actual letters.
So I understand what you're saying, that one is to be aware that there are stages to writing, and that means that scribbling is not scribbling. It's actually just a slightly more lower developed form of writing for the students, and they are going to move towards writing as we know it. And the second thing is not just knowing that these stages exist, but also being able to identify what stage the student is at, and then helping them along the way there. So, okay, now I've identified the stage. What should I do now with the student? How do I get them to become more familiar with the letters, etc.?
One is giving students as many chances to express in writing as you can, and it will show up as scribbling. It will show up as squiggles that you just can't understand. But giving students as many opportunities as you can to write about authentic things, like asking them to write their name. You won't be able to read it, but asking them to write a note to a friend, asking them to list or to label things that they see around the classroom on sticky notes. Again, we may not, at the early stages, we will not be able to read what they're writing because it's scribbles, it's squiggles. But here, the most important part is to then talk to the students and ask them what is it that they've drawn, what is it that they've written. And that question and their answers to it really helps us identify which stage of writing they're at. And we can probably look at a real example that we have pictures of from a really great website called Reading Rockets, where they've put up pictures of what students have drawn and scribbled, and then the conversations that the teachers have had with them, and how they've identified what stage the child is at.
Right. So I think that's an important point where you're saying that talking to the students helps us understand what in their world what those symbols actually mean, because hey, these are symbols that we've all made up, right? So yeah, so now we can just go to those. Can you just describe these pictures that are up there and what just elaborate on the point that you were trying to make?
Yeah. So we're looking at two pictures. The one on the left is by a boy who was about 4 years old when he made this. And if he's 4, then he's either ending nursery or is in lower KG at this point. And the second picture is by a girl who's 5 years old, means that either end of low KG or beginning of upper KG. And you can see the difference in the development in both the pictures from 4 to 5. But we'll dive a little deeper into them to understand what exactly this is. So let's look at the picture on the left. And here when the teacher looked at it, didn't really understand what the child was doing. Nothing really here looks much like the writing that we know of. But then the teacher did what was the right thing to do, which is asking that boy, what is it? What have you drawn? What have you tried to show us here? And the teacher pointed to what was written above, which are letter-like forms, what we were talking about. And what have you written here? And the child said, "This is me and my family."
Hmm.
And I've drawn my family below it. So two things here which really stand out. One is that the child is writing letter-like forms, but doesn't really know how to connect letters to their sounds. So he knows that letters tell us something, but really doesn't know how to do that. And secondly, uh, and this is a really positive thing, is that he knows that pictures and words convey separate things. They're not one entity. He's drawn a picture below and he's written something about it above. He's labeled it above. So that's a great place to be at, to be able to distinguish those things. In the picture again, we can recognize some letters. We can see the small e, we can see the small k, we can see the small y, and also maybe a capital F. We can sort of make out these letters. So we can see that he knows their form. And I think one more thing that we can see, which is great, is that he's writing from left to right, because there's space on the right that is left blank. And so he knows that he has to write from left to right. And this is where the child is. So based on this, the next steps for the teacher would be to now start focusing on letter sound relationships, to start focusing on writing letters more clearly.
Right.
Because the child is there now. He's moved on from scribbling to writing letter-like forms.
Right. So yeah, I think that was very helpful because it really helps others and our viewers understand how do we assess or identify the level of a student. So now, if you can just contrast the picture on the left with the picture on the right.
Right. So again, the left to right, we can see it's not very clear writing, so the child still needs to develop her letter writing skills. But what is very different is that when the teacher asked this child what she had written, she said, "I've written me and my friends play." Now we can see that she's very close to representing the sounds with the right letters. Me is completely correctly spelled. And she started with A, she has a D, there's no N in the middle, which is completely understandable because middle sounds are the most difficult for kids. My, again, she's gotten the first letter right. My friends, she knew that the first letter was F, but didn't really know much after that. And play, she knew that the letter P needed to start off that word. So she's letter sound connection seems to be a lot higher for this child, and the letters do look like letters a lot more at this age.
Right. Right. So the first, I mean, one of the bigger things that I noticed, and thanks a lot for, walking us through that, because I think it helps in understanding how do we level students or how do we identify the level of the students. But the biggest thing that I saw there is the teachers have allowed the students to do what they want. I mean, there has been a lot of freedom given and said that, hey, what I want you to do, I'm guessing is what was told to them that, hey, draw your family or friends or whatever it is and write and give a title to your painting or your sketch. And that amount of freedom I've not seen in any Indian classrooms, it's just frowned upon. It's almost frowned upon. They're like, no, I'll hold your hand and make it move and write the right letter. I mean, how many times has that happened to me as a kid also? So I think that also tells me that there is a need for giving such kind of freedom, or what would you call it? It's I don't even know what to call it right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think freedom is the right word, and it's important because we really then understand what stage the child is at. If you're having all kids either trace out letters on a sheet of paper or copy from the board, we're never going to know where that particular child is either struggling or excelling, and knowing both is important. So freedom, I think, is the right word, with a very clear lens of what stage of writing they're at.
I think this goes back very well to a lot of times when you say the same thing, that hey, give them freedom with a lot of structure. This is exactly a very good example of that, right? I mean, the structure is there because you know exactly what levels you're looking for, but the freedom is there for the student. The student doesn't understand the structure there, but you as an educator understand that hey, this structure is extremely important for me to know what to do next with the students or that specific student. That's I think an important point, and that's why I just wanted to highlight it. Right. So, what I see is that you give them a lot of opportunities to write. You talk to them about what they're writing, and I'm going to say writing without the quotes because I'm going to have to say it with the quotes all the time otherwise. And when the students are writing, you are talking to them, trying to figure out what they are trying to represent and then hence understand what those letters or symbols actually mean. Anything else that you would want to do as an educator to, you know, ensure that handwriting skills develop?
I think taking a holistic approach to learning is very important. Giving kids lots of opportunities to read uh, different stories, different poems, and different fonts. It's not necessary to ensure that every book has the same font that kids will recognize. Getting them to sing, dance, combining phonics learning with motor exercises, or jumping around, playing, taking a very holistic approach, so that all of these connections are made in their brains. These connections become strong. And of course, like you said before, that doesn't mean that we're giving them complete freedom to do whatever they want and sing and dance all day. All of these activities have to be planned with very clear milestones and learning outcomes in mind. So we as educators need to know what is it that we want kids to get out of this. While kids know that they're having fun, it's not boring, they have the freedom to express how they want to express themselves, whether that's by talking or whether that's by writing, drawing, which is super important.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, so I think we can stop here, and I think it was an enlightening discussion about why writing is difficult, how we can make it less difficult for the students, what are the evolutionary or the psychological or the biological reasons why handwriting needs to be given a lot of importance, even in a world where students are probably not going to write that much in the future. But for the development, why handwriting is important. So thanks a lot, Ritu. And thank you all for watching. If you like the video, please like it and subscribe and do all the other things, comment, ask us questions, disagree with us, whatever you want. And please, please, please tell all your friends about us. Thanks, everyone.